It's going to be recorded on my computer and probably just available via social media. So what we're looking at here is the pick 2 out of 3. And I just want to kind of outline this, and I've done it via color because I'm a very visual learner. So there's 3 suppositions we can make about God. We put them in somewhat theological language. Number 1, that God is omnipotent. That means all powerful, literally. God has control and power over everything. Number 2 is omniscient, which is quite hard to read in the yellow, my apologies, which means that God is all-knowing. So God is aware of everything going on. And number 3 is omnibenevolent, which means that God is all good and wants to be and do good in the world around us. So these 3 things, omnipotent, all-powerful, omniscient, all-knowing, and omnibenevolent, all good, are the 3 things which can't all be true. If there is evil, and it's pretty undeniable to most of us that there is evil, then these 3 things, if they were true, wouldn't be possible with evil being present, because it's not logically able to exist. The only way that all 3 of these things can be true is if we deny that evil exists. And that's the first theological route we could take, is we could say actually evil doesn't exist, or what seems evil isn't evil. And many theologians have taken that approach, more in Christian context than Jewish ones. But you will find Jewish theologians who say actually evil doesn't exist, it's all an illusion. And if you're willing to say that, then we can end it right here. You don't need to go any further. You can just say God is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, and evil is a lie. But I don't think most of us are willing to say that. And I don't think, especially right now, probably we're willing to say that. And certainly when considering the Holocaust, it makes it very hard to say it's all an illusion. Because we're talking about real suffering on a huge scale. The result is, if evil is real, then we have to choose 2 out of 3 of these. And that creates 3 different options. So option 1 is the addition of 1 and 2, red and yellow make orange, which is God is omnipotent and omniscient, but not omnibenevolent. So in real language, right, God can fix the world and knows what's going on, but for whatever reason doesn't want to, isn't good, is perfectly happy with evil taking place. This image of God is at the very most charitable end of our reckoning indifferent. At a less charitable end, it might be a very cruel image of God. God is able to fix things, but chooses not to, because God isn't all good. And that's one way that we can approach the question of theodicy, and we'll see some sources that do exactly that. Generally, I think that many of us may cringe at them because they seem very foreign to our own experience, but it is an absolutely perfectly well-sourced approach in Judaism to say that God is not all good. Second choice is that God is omnipotent and omnibenevolent, 1 and 3, but actually not omniscient. And as a result, we have purple. So God can fix what's going on and wants to because God is all good, but actually doesn't know what's happening, is ignorant of what's going on in the world around us. So God would fix it if God could, or if God knew, but doesn't know what's going on. So it's the lack of knowledge. God in this framework, in the purple one, is ignorant, is in many ways invisible, or this God is absent and invisible in a lot of ways. And the combination of those 2 things is what creates that image of God. And we'll see sources that approach God as that, as absent in some way, and perhaps even somewhat kind of ignorant of the reality of the world around us. The third option, as you can guess, is a combination of 2 and 3, leaving out option 1. So this would say that God is omniscient and omnibenevolent, but not omnipotent. So God knows what's going on, wants it to be good, but for whatever reason can't fix it. God doesn't have the power to fix it. And what you'll see is that in these 3 choices, we're less so choosing what we think God is, and more so choosing what God isn't. So you have to accept, at least according to Rabbi Kushner, and I think it fits our source as well, that either God isn't all good in the first, or isn't all knowing in the second, or isn't all powerful in the third. And in many ways, it's a balance of which version of God do we find most and least palatable, which one can we live with, which one fits our faith, because we have to, at some point, accept that one of these things must be missing if evil exists and is real and is around us. Okay? So I can't really see everyone, but if there's any questions on that before we look at the sources, you're welcome to unmute yourself and shout it out. Too many people for me to see in these little boxes. Right. Okay. So what I want to do is look over and switch the sources now. Normally, I'd have you doing the reading of the sources, but with the difficulties of Zoom, it's quite hard to do that. So you're going to get stuck with me reading them, I'm afraid. And I'm going to try and explain as we look at them where each one is from and what their significance is. But we also have to see them in their context. So it's important that I say from the get-go that all of these sources are post-Holocaust. So all of these are post-1943, really. Some are in the course of the Holocaust responding to it. All of them are Jewish theologians. Most are rabbis. Some are authors who are not rabbis, but knowledgeable and educated and influential people. And all of them are trying to answer the same question, which is, why did the Holocaust happen? How do we understand it in terms of our relationship with God? And I've organized them. They weren't organized themselves this way, but I've organized them in exactly the same way as the three colors we've just seen, right? The option of God either being omnipotent and omniscient, but not omnibenevolent, or as the others are, omniscient and omnibenevolent, but not omnipotent, or omnipotent, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent, but not omniscient. And we'll see each of those. The English words are quite hazardous, which is why I keep those colors in mind. And I've also labeled them here with the words I referenced before. Option 1 is that God is indifferent. That's the one that we see here. Option 2 is that God is invisible. And option 3 is that God is impotent. And we'll see each of those played out. And I'm curious, when we get through all of these, for people to share which one they find most compelling. You're going to hear my view, inevitably, because it's quite strong, but I think all of them deserve their ability to be recognized in their own merits. So first source here, just to give you some context, this is from Rabbi Eliezer Menachem Shach. He's one of the most significant leaders of what we now call Haredi Judaism, that is ultra-Orthodox, or in the UK often known as strictly Orthodox Judaism. And this was a question and answer that was in a Haredi newspaper in 1990, in which someone asked exactly the questions that we have in mind, and Rabbi Shach gives an answer. So I'll read the question and then the answer, but you can also hopefully see it on your screen and can read along as well. So the question that was asked says this: I would like to put forward a question, a thought that I've had for many years. Decades ago, there was a Holocaust. In this Holocaust, 6 million Jews were destroyed. The question that stands before us, with all of the pain and loss of our 6 million brothers, B'nai Yisrael, there is not one family that did not suffer from the Holocaust. Everyone suffered because of this horrible Holocaust that was decreed on our people. Is this not the case? We must pause and wonder, why did this happen? The grammar is questionable. It's taken as an excerpt, so you have to excuse the poor grammar of the author. But Rabbi Shach tries to give an answer to the question, which is obviously, how do we understand the Holocaust? And how do we understand God? And he says the following: God forbid, one must not think that God is cruel after all. He is merciful and compassionate, King. What has God done to us? Did this happen for no reason? Does a wild human being like Hitler, Yimach Shemo, which means may his name be erased, have the power to annihilate 6 million Jews? If we think this is true, then we are lacking in our faith in divine providence and the creator of the world and his creations. It is clear that the answer is very obvious. God kept count of each and every sin in a running count over hundreds of years until the count amounted to 6 million Jews. And that is how the Holocaust occurred. So must a Jew believe. And if a Jew does not completely believe this, he is a heretic. And if we do not accept this as a punishment, then it is as if we don't believe in the Holy One, blessed be he. After exterminating the 6 million, he began counting again. Now things are quiet and good for us because the new count has not reached its conclusion. However, when it does, then there will be a new period of judgment. I don't know how other people find that. I think if I got up on Shabbat and gave this as a sermon, we'd have some revolt. I see some thumbs down from the audience here. It is pretty shocking for many of us to see a rabbi use this language, just to point out the strength of some of this language, which is really quite strong, right? He's saying, first of all, human beings don't have the power. So he's negating the concept that free will is the cause of it, that Hitler and others have the power to cause such death. And he's saying explicitly that God actually is responsible for every single death. God is responsible and actively involved, and is actively involved by virtue of the fact that there's this kind of complicated mathematics of punishment that's going on in the background. That every time someone does something wrong, God keeps a tally, and at some point there's so much bad stuff that the Jews have to account for that a certain number of them have to die as a result. And I think perhaps most troubling to me is he says that anyone who doesn't believe this is a heretic, which is very typical of Haredi approaches, which is not something generally Jews bother with. We don't generally talk about heresy because we don't have any assumed dogmatic beliefs. If you don't have a dogma, you can't have a heretic. But he says, not only is this my view, he's not saying me, Rabbi Shach, am saying this. He's saying this is the unquestionable truth, and if you don't believe it, you're a heretic. And he also is saying that it's going to continue and actually going to repeat itself, because the counter may have been emptied, but the counter has since been continuing. And in the 70 or 80 years since he's imagining that this great kind of bloodletting took place, there's going to be another one, because inevitably people will build up the same negative balance. To me, it seems very clear that this is a description of God as not omnibenevolent, right? Because generally, I don't think of God being good as meaning that God is punishing everyone, innocent people, for the collective sins of other people. But interestingly, he starts the answer by forestalling that conclusion and saying, God forbid, don't think God is cruel. God's not cruel. God's just been keeping track of everyone's sins, and as a result has punished everyone in this mechanical, mathematical, logical way. It's quite unsettling, I think. And it's interesting to understand how a Jew in 1990 would see this and look back at the Holocaust through these eyes. But I don't think most of us probably relate to the Holocaust this way, I'm assuming. This is not the best format to have a discussion, but I'm curious, if anyone wants to chime in at any point, you're welcome to, because I don't know that this is something that anyone would feel that they personally identify with. Personally, speaking of my own way, if anyone told me this answer, I'd find that very wrong. But don't worry, it gets worse. So his second answer here is from Rabbi Eliyahu Dessler. This is in a famous collection of Musar, ethical literature, called Michtav Me'Eliyahu, a letter from Elijah. This is one of the most published books in contemporary Jewish life. You will find Michtav Me'Eliyahu in every Haredi bookstore, in many Haredi homes. It's continually pointed to as the pinnacle of moral writing in the 21st century. And in it, among other things, he addresses the question of the Holocaust. And this is what he says. It is clear that the era of the emancipation was given to us by God to serve as a time for preparation for the coming of the Mashiach. To this end, the yoke of exile was eased from upon us, but we used the situation to mix with the Gentiles and imitate them. The process of assimilation has been progressing at an ever-quickening rate, and yet the disaster has not overtaken us until now. This is because the Holy One, blessed be He, delays His anger. He does not punish until we have reached the limit, and there's no longer hope that kindness will lead to improvement. He doesn't say it quite as explicitly, but he's got the same framework in mind as Rabbi Shach. And keep in mind, he's writing this in the 1950s. This is someone who spent most of his time at Gateshead. He's telling us, actually, it's such a shame that we brought this on ourselves, but we brought it on ourselves. We brought it on ourselves here specifically by virtue of assimilation, by virtue of the post-emancipation Jewish enlightenment, of the Jewish integration with society around us. And the result is that God can no longer, even though God is so compassionate, God can no longer hold back the floodgate of disaster and is now kind of being unleashed upon us. Very much like Rabbi Shach, very much assuming the same assumptions about who God is. And to me, very much reading in a similar way as not seeing God as all good. These both rabbis here seem to take a certain pleasure in imagining that God is responsible for what we perceive as evil. They're partially suggesting it's not as evil as it seems because it has a reason, but they, I hope, would not deny that people are suffering as a result of God's recompense for everyone's misdeeds. So whether or not they say it, they definitely have this mode in which they're recognizing God as omnipotent and omniscient, but actually not very good, not omnibenevolent. At best, indifferent. At worst, kind of a jerk. The third one is from a American leader of Haredi Judaism, Yuval Teitelbaum, who's also very influential. All three of these men were some of the center pieces of creating Haredi Judaism, which is very much a post-Holocaust construction, this ultra-Orthodoxy. It didn't exist before that. And all three of them have the same themes as a result. He's writing in 1961, and he's writing from a slightly different point of view in terms of identifying the cause of God's bloodletting against us, but nonetheless working in the same framework. So he says, no one takes note of the fact that 6 million Jews were killed because of these Zionist groups, who drew the heart of the nation to their cause and violated the oath of hastening the end by claiming sovereignty and freedom before the time. The very beginning of their establishment, for many years, they informed terribly on the Jews of the nations and spoke of them badly to the authorities, as though the Jews were highly dangerous to the nations and they had to be expelled from their countries, which the Zionists did, thinking that it would thereby be easier for them to carry out their scheme to come to the land of Israel and to organize a government there. We saw already then in their letters that great rabbis were greatly, deathly fearful that they, the Zionists, would bring about that which, for our many sins, did come to be afterwards. So Rabbi Teitelbaum identifies a very specific culprit. It's not everyone's sins, and it's not, as Rabbi Dessler said above, the emancipation and assimilation of the Jewish community. It's very specifically the Zionist movement, and the fact that he constructs this, to me, somewhat paranoid vision of the Zionists as being traitors to the Jewish people, as informing upon the Jewish people to the nations, as kind of stirring up trouble by virtue of pursuing immigration to the land of Israel, etc. This framework, by the way, this thinking, what we have right here in this text, is the basis for a lot of the Haredi anti-Zionist activity even today. If you watch, a variety of news coverage of, say, the conference which Iran hosted some years ago about Holocaust denial, there was a whole group of Haredi Jews there, and they were there to try and change the narrative, to try and suggest that actually the Zionists are the bad Jews and they're the good Jews. And they're doing exactly that because of these sources, because not only do they see the Zionist movement as a traitor to Jewish tradition, but they also see it as responsible for the Holocaust. This isn't even the strongest articulation of that view. There's other places where they take it even further. And there was even violence among different Jewish communities as a result of some of these viewpoints. So we have, looking here, at least first three sources, our first answer. Now, it may not be a very satisfying answer, but it's an answer which is undeniably coming out of a Jewish theological approach to the question of the Holocaust. It's Jewish rabbis looking at the question saying, yeah, here's why it happened. What all three are saying is clearly that God is not all good, at least not how we would normally think of it. They probably would say that this is God being good. But I think undeniably we can look at these sources and say that vision of God is not one where God is all good, all loving, all compassion, all kindness. This is a vision of God which is angry and wrathful, which has recompense for people's misdeeds. This is a vision of God which is taking vengeance upon people for other people's sins. And it's also a vision of God which is particularly focusing in on those social and cultural groups which the Haredi thinkers cited here see as being the enemy. So, a couple observations about this are that all three of these are from Haredi thinkers. You won't find this view articulated in non-Haredi Jewish circles, and the fact that it's actually very normative in the Haredi intellectual world. So this is not something that's questioned generally among Haredi thinkers. This is the default assumption about the Holocaust. I'm curious if anyone wants to react to that before we go on to the next ones. I'm aware that it's just me talking for so long. Anyone?
I just got a general question. Would the Chabad come under the general heading of Haredi, or are they separate?
Yes, thank you, Lorraine. So Haredi is basically everything right of the United Synagogue. so to speak. It's a kind of a false construction, but it generally means both Hasidic and non-Hasidic ultra-Orthodox Jews. So it does include Chabad and other Hasidic groups like Satmar, and it also includes non-Hasidic ultra-Orthodox Jews. More the type that you'd find at Gateshead. So it's both Gateshead and Chabad. Obviously, there's nuance as there is with anything, and most Haredi Jews don't self-identify that way. They only see themselves as Jews and everyone else is not. But generally, we can easily see where those lines are in terms of dress and practice, but even more than dress and practice in terms of how they view certain questions in Jewish history, and this is a big one.
Thanks.
Yeah. Any other thoughts or reflections or questions on these three sources, this first view? Anyone feel like this is the right answer for them and they're persuaded now and they understand the Holocaust and how it fits into Jewish history? Moira's shaking her head, I can see that. And yeah, sorry, Gillian and Ian, I see you have a hand up. I can't hear you though, I'm afraid. No, okay, that's all right. I see, Leonie, are you speaking there? Robert and Leonie?
Robert, I'm curious to ask why you've chosen 3 Haredi rabbis rather than, from different points of view.
So we're going to see some of the other points of view, but what I wanted to show is this first, if we break it down the way that we did earlier from Rabbi Kushner, this first choice, option 1 on the buffet of Jewish theodicy is God isn't all good. And the only sources I could find that articulate the view that God isn't all good are these ones coming out of the Haredi world. I've never seen a Jewish thinker who's not from this world say the things that are said here. They usually take a different approach, which is what we'll see next. We look at the other two. Okay. So let's head on down and look at the second one. So just to remind you, and a couple people have joined us, so I'm going to pop back momentarily over to our first document here, where you can see our 3 possible combinations, right? Just to remind you, there's 3 suppositions we can make about God. God's all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good. And we can combine those 3 different ways, and we have to choose 2 because otherwise evil doesn't make sense. So we've just looked at this one in orange. God's omnipotent and omniscient, but not omnibenevolent. God is powerful and knowing, but actually not very good, at least in the way that we think about good as meaning benefit to us. God is perfectly happy to bring suffering upon people for reasons which these thinkers see as very valid. We're going to look now at the one in purple, which is that God is omnipotent and omnibenevolent, but not omniscient. So God is powerful and God is good, but God doesn't really know what's happening. And there's a variety of ways they try and explain that. That's what I want to look at now. Jumping back over to here, we're going to look at this, number 2, an invisible God. Okay, so I've tried to explain in one sentence what the view is. The first view I explained here is Holocaust as punishment and or redemptive end of days drama. And the second one here is Holocaust is evidence of God's absence. Okay, so this first source, which we're going to look at, which very much speaks to Robert, your point, is from Rabbi Eliezer Berkowitz. He was someone who was very much kind of on the line between what we call modern Orthodoxy and what we might call Haredi Judaism. He went between both worlds. And the result is that he often had a slightly different view. And we can see that here in how he responds to what we've seen above. It's not a direct response. He didn't write it in response, but it's in the milieu of the time that he's trying to address the same questions. He's writing in 1973, and he says these 3 things. There are 3 different paragraphs I've taken from his writing that each help to give us a sense of his view. So just to look at the beginning, not for a single moment shall we entertain the idea that what happened to European Jewry was divine punishment for any sins committed by them. Clearly he doesn't agree with the guys up there. It was injustice absolute. It was injustice countenanced by God. But if we hold on to our faith in a personal God, such absolute injustice cannot be a mere mishap in the divine scheme of things. Somehow there must be room for it in the scheme, in which case the ultimate responsibility for this ultimate evil must be God's. So he's nuancing. He's saying, yes, God must be responsible because that's what we believe, but there must be more to it. And he's going to try and explain why that is. He says, the hiding God is present, though man is unaware of him. He is present in his hiddenness. Therefore, God can only hide in this world. But if this world were altogether and radically profane, there would be no place in it for him to hide. He can only hide in history. Since history is man's responsibility, one would, in fact, expect him to hide, to be silent, while man is about his God-given task. Responsibility requires freedom, but God's convincing presence would undermine the freedom of human decision. God hides in human responsibility and human freedom. So he's introducing two ideas, one of free will, which is probably something we're quite comfortable accepting, that people have the freedom to choose what they do, and this idea that God is self-hidden, is choosing to hide, because otherwise people wouldn't be able to make up their own minds. He says in his third quote here, God cannot as a rule intervene whenever man's use of freedom displeases him. It is true, if he did so, the perpetration of evil would be rendered impossible, but so would the possibility for good disappear. Man can be frightened, but he cannot be bludgeoned into goodness. If God did not respect man's freedom to choose his course in personal responsibility, not only would the moral good and evil be abolished from the earth, but man himself would go with them. For freedom and responsibility are the very essence of man. Without them, man is not human. If there is to be man, he must be allowed to make his choices in freedom. If he has such freedom, he will use it. Using it, he will often use it wrongly. He will decide for the wrong alternative. As he does so, there will be suffering for the innocent. So, somewhat like what I said at the very beginning, is that you could kind of answer the question of the Holocaust very simply by looking at human evil. And that's what Rabbi Berkowitz does here, but he doesn't do that entirely because he still wants to explain God. So he says, yes, people are bad, and actually, if God stepped in every time people did bad things, then free will would not be something which is real. It's only real if we allow people to make bad decisions. It's only real if God is absent from the picture. He has a vision that God is absent by choice, that God chooses to stand back to allow people to make decisions, right or wrong, and is not, as a result, going to intervene when people make the wrong decisions. And he connects this with what he said above in the second paragraph, this idea that God hides in history, which is a very profoundly Jewish notion, that it's in history where God is most evident in people's decision, in the violence and hope and power of what happens historically. That's where God is present, at least in his conception, but not in an obvious way, in a hidden way. So he doesn't quite say that God is not omniscient, and let's remember our framework for this one. He doesn't say that God doesn't know what's going on. He suggests that God chooses not to know, chooses to look away, chooses to be ignorant of the fact, so as to allow people the choice of what they are going to do voluntarily. In some ways, it's very understandable if anyone's a parent. You can't always make decisions for your children. You have to sometimes step away and let them make the wrong decision. And that's very much the conception of God here, is that God's power rests on God's ability to step away. By the way, apology for the kind of poor language of many of these sources. I chose not to change them, but they use man over and over to refer to humanity, and they always use the capital H, he, for God. I hate it personally, but I decided it wasn't right to change their own language. But you can imagine the way in which this is actually a very universal framework. It's not specific to the Jews, it's not specific to the Zionists, not specific to the assimilation of Jews after the emancipation. It's a very wide framework theologically in which we think about free will as being the primary factor behind the Holocaust. I think it's very relatable, it's very understandable, and from a historical point of view, it makes history itself the place in which religion is most able to think about God, not in philosophy, but in history, which is a really interesting approach. There's a second source here, which is a little bit more explicit about some of these ideas. This is from Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, who some might know. It was one of the biggest leaders in what we might call modern Orthodoxy in America. He was the kind of person responsible behind Yeshiva University and a huge amount of what is maybe modern or centrist Orthodoxy. He's very much United Synagogue. And in the British sense, you can see here that we're getting more towards our direction of things as we go on. The first sources were all in the Haredi world. These two gentlemen are kind of in and out of the Haredi world, but leaning more towards a more modern outlook on the world. these probably aren't guys who wore black hats every day, only sometimes. And that gives us some framework into why they're saying the things they're saying and how they think about it. It's interesting to look at how the identification of these sources, the authors of them, change with the content of their views. So Rabbi Soloveitchik draws on a quote from Deuteronomy and then tries to explain it. So let's just look first at the quote here, translated as, "Then my anger will flare up against them in that day, and I will abandon them and hide my face from them. And they shall be devoured, and many evils and distress shall befall them, so that they will say on that day, surely it is because our God is not in our midst that these evils have befallen us." So this is a direct quote from Deuteronomy. It's in a section which we see as curses, which we often read in an undertone and very quick because we don't want to address all the negative things that are being said. And hidden in this section on curses about this view of this future day in which we will be in such distress is this view that God is going to voluntarily hide God's face. Right? I will abandon them and I will hide my face from them. So it's a purposeful veiling, a choosing not to know. And that's what Rabbi Soloveitchik picks up on. He says, Hester panim, which literally means hidden face, face hiding, involves a temporary abandonment of the world, a suspension of God's active surveillance. Surveillance is a key word. As Rashi explains on that verse, the one we read above, as though I do not see their distress. Right, so Rashi explains the verse as saying that God chooses to ignore, as though I do not see. Hester pani may be explained as a temporary and partial reversion of the world to its pre-creation state, when chaos and void prevailed, a period without physical patterns, a state of chaotic sub-existence. God's moral law, as we know it, was similarly inoperative and inapplicable in a setting so unformed and unstable. The Holocaust was Hester panim. We cannot explain the Holocaust, but we can at least classify it theologically, characterize it, even if we have no answer to the question why. The unbounded horrors represented the chaos and void anarchy of the pre-creation state. This is how the world would appear when God's moderating surveillance is suspended. I find this really interesting, really thoughtful, and actually it's a really good way of explaining a lot of the views which are embedded underneath this. This idea that Hester panim, hidden face, is actually a state which God can kind of turn on and off, and which is turned on at certain times, and as a result, God is not able to see what's going on. So it's as if God has a security camera on the world, and sometimes what God's seeing is so distressing that just turns off the switch. That's what Rabbi Soloveitchik is suggesting the Holocaust was, a time in which God was not paying attention purposefully, and as a result, it went back to this kind of pre-creation anarchic state where God doesn't have any ability to intervene. This is very much the view that God is not omniscient, at least in this qualified, caveated way, that at least during the Holocaust, God chose not to be omniscient. So this view of Rabbi Soloveitchik, together with the one above, Rabbi Verkovitz, is very much that God is omnipotent and omnibenevolent. God is all-powerful and all good, all loving, but actually, at least sometimes, chooses to be not all-knowing, not omniscient, to restrict God's knowledge, to not have full surveillance of the world. And the result is that in that darkness, when God is not watching, things go really sideways. You'll also notice, so a couple things to notice about these sources sociologically. One, they're not from Haredi rabbis, they're from centrist modern Orthodox rabbis. And also, they don't suggest that this is the only way to see the question of the Holocaust, right? All three of the first ones said, if you don't think like me, you're wrong. These both say, listen, we don't really understand, but here's an answer. And there's a very big different rhetorical step that's being made between the first sources and between these ones. When actually, Soloveitchik specifically says, we have no answer to the question, but we can at least categorize it. Right? We can at least understand what the Holocaust is as a phenomenon, even if we can't understand why in particular that moment God turned off the cameras. Any responses that people have to this view of God as not omniscient, of not paying attention purposefully or not purposefully of being unavailable to watch and to see what's going on? Does this seem more relatable or less, or is it something that you find inspirational perhaps, or at least justifiable?
It's a little more relatable, but does anyone speculate as to why God might choose to hide God's face?
I mean, I think the implication, Johnny, is that actually underneath this, they believe the same thing as the previous rabbis, which is that God had to turn off the cameras, hide God's face, because of the sin and misdeeds of the people on earth. So I think there's an assumption underneath it that actually people did do something wrong, and as a result, they kind of forced God's hand, but they never come out and say it so explicitly. And they certainly don't say, if you don't believe this, you're a heretic. But I assume they have the same thing.
Yeah. So it's like, you know, when you're so disgusted by something, you know, that someone's done. I've nearly said your kids, but that's not fair. You just sort of get up and walk away.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like, it's very much this, you know, we pushed God so far that God just left. So, right, the first approach is we pushed God so far that God killed us. And this approach is we pushed God so far that God left the building. So it makes God less directly responsible for death. In this case, God is responsible because of a passivity, because of an absence. In God's absence, bad things happened, but God is only absent because things went so sideways in the first place. It's not an accident.
Thank you.
Any other feelings about these sources, about God not being omniscient? Anyone have any personal feeling about this sense? Do you think God is watching?
One quick question from myself. I've had the privilege to hear many survivors speak and have asked questions, and one of the key questions and answers that's come up is, how did you get through the atrocity of this time? And a lot of the time the answer was faith and prayer and across some other things. Now, obviously this approach is very well known, but the idea there of prayer, if you're arguing that, you know, God hid his face for however many years during the Holocaust, then were those prayers for waste? I.e., if that face is hidden and in essence it's not there and not watching, what happened to those prayers? But then also, in times where, okay, you know, not necessarily saying God forbid a Holocaust, but where there is, you know, even a pandemic like what we're in now, you know, if you are going and praying for this to come over, and there's this idea that Hester Panim that is facing, what's happening to those prayers, and is that not just a waste?
I mean, I think it's a really good question, Scott, and I'm also aware of the fact that we do have in our midst this evening someone who has survived the Holocaust, and probably, Kitty, if you're welcome to chime in if you'd like to. It's a privilege to have you here, because I'm sure you've put a lot of thought into these questions and seen a lot of answers given over the years of different texts and literatures trying to explain the Holocaust. But I do think, Scott, you're right to point out that actually prayer in this framework is not a very operative category, at least not if prayer is to get God's attention. So there's kind of a difference perhaps in how you see prayer. Some tend to see prayer as a way of getting God's attention, a kind of flag we're waving to say, look, it's a mess down here, in which case it would be quite ridiculous to do, considering if we might believe God is absent in the first place. Or you might see it the opposite way, that actually the thing that would bring God back into the world, the thing that would draw back, is the prayer. And many authors who would have that view would point to the Exodus, in which you have hundreds of years of suffering, and the Torah makes pains to describe that the Israelites cried out many, many times, and then God shows up on the scene, somewhat belatedly. So some would say maybe it's precisely that which needs to happen is more prayer. Some would say prayer is kind of a ridiculous category. And some might say a third thing, which is that prayer isn't for God to hear, but rather for us to be able to understand ourselves and to reflect on ourselves better. So it kind of depends how you see prayer, and also whether you think it works. That's probably not a very good answer, but it's a question which I'm sure comes up a lot in terms of, you know, what the utility of prayer might be and what the usefulness of ritual might be when someone is faced with really significant suffering.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Kitty, I can see you speaking, but we can't hear you, so I'm just going to unmute you. There you go.
I was just saying that people were praying and were shot as they were praying, and they felt prayer didn't actually help. So it didn't matter how much they prayed, there was nothing they could do to alleviate it. So in many respects, prayer was futile in Auschwitz, in my opinion. That's what happened. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to see any real results from prayer when there's so much suffering going on.
No, that's right.
I think some people I've heard would say, prayer helped them. They helped them to get through it. It helped them to have strength. But I don't think anyone would be so foolish as to say that it worked.
But when you
because
actually
clearly,
saw them being killed as they were praying,
yeah,
this was the problem.
yeah,
Actually seeing people killed as they were praying, this was, something they didn't expect, I think. They expected some mercy from up above, and it didn't come.
It's really powerful to hear you say that, Kitty, and also it's really connected to one of the next sources from Elie Wiesel, who talks about exactly or a similar experience about the frustration with not having the sense that God is paying any attention or even able to pay attention.
That's right.
So just to pick up where we were there, right? We have these sources here that have all said that God is not all-knowing, and that's our kind of second option. First one being God's not all good. This one being God's not all-knowing. We're going to get onto a third one now, which is that God's not all-powerful. So for me, this is a gradations towards more reasonable theology. I think the first one is unacceptable. The second one is workable. I think this one is the only one potentially that is usable for us as modern people. And obviously I've framed it that way. If anyone feels differently, I'd be curious to hear. But these, I think, help to give us some sense of how we can understand God as not being all powerful. So this version of God, the impotent God, is all knowing and all good, wants to do good, can know what's going on, but isn't able to fix it. And in particular, one of the themes of these texts is that the Holocaust is a trauma for God as well as people, and we'll see that in our third one. So we're going to look at three texts here, first from Elie Wiesel, second from Hans Jonas, and the third from a Hasidic rabbi, the rabbi of the Warsaw Ghetto. So the breakdown kind of falls apart, where the first ones were all Haredim, second ones were all modern Orthodox. Here we have a relatively secular Holocaust survivor in Elie Wiesel, and then Hans Jonas, a philosopher, not a rabbi, and then a rabbi who is from the Hasidic tradition, but has a very different view than those first sources. So this is an excerpt from the book Night. It's one that I read as a relatively young person and found very powerful. And this particular story stuck in my mind, as it has for many people, that Elie Wiesel tells in the course of the story. And I think that it hits right on the nose some of the questions we've addressed, and especially, Kitty, what you've just suggested about the inability to look at what's going on and suggest that anything else is possible. So I'll just read this, but you can see it in front of you as well. And it is quite upsetting, but of course that's our subject today. One day when we came back from work, we saw 3 gallows rearing up in the assembly place, 3 black crows. Roll call, SS all around us, machine guns trained, the traditional ceremony. 3 victims in chains, and one of them, the little servant, the sad-eyed angel. The SS seemed more preoccupied, more disturbed than usual. To hang a young boy in front of thousands of spectators was no light matter. The head of the camp read the verdict. All eyes were on the child. He was lividly pale, almost calm, biting his lips. The gallows threw its shadow over him. "Where is God? Where is he?" someone behind me asked. At a sign from the head of the camp, the 3 chairs tipped over. Total silence throughout the camp. On the horizon, the sun was setting. Then the march past began. The 2 adults were no longer alive. Their tongues hung swollen, blue-tinged. But the 3rd rope was still moving. Being so light, the child was still alive. For more than half an hour he stayed there, struggling between life and death, dying in slow agony under our eyes. And we had to look him full in the face. He was still alive when I passed in front of him. His tongue was still red. His eyes were not yet glazed. Behind me, I heard the same man asking, "Where is God now?" And I heard a voice within me answer him. "Where is he? Here he is. He's hanging here on this gallows." So I find this, obviously it's quite emotional story, and Elie Wiesel tells it in a very powerful way. A lot of people have approached this particular story in the book as a rejection of God, of a kind of sentiment of atheism, that God is in fact dead in a Nietzsche type way, that Elie Wiesel is pointing to the boy slowly dying and saying that God is there dying. But there's another way to read this, which is actually more consonant with the Jewish sources that Wiesel might be in conversation with, at least in his youth, where actually there's a view that God is embodied in many ways in people's experience, and that God suffers when people suffer, right? I think for many people, when I taught this at the Abbey, a lot of the people who read this, some of whom had never read Night before, went, oh, this makes total sense because it's so relatable to us as Christians, right? It's so relatable to us as Christians, the idea that God is suffering and that his pain is relatable to us and that God's death is somehow redemptive, etc. For us as Jews, that doesn't have the same resonance. But we have to keep in mind that it's our tradition from which the Christian sources derive their notion of God as suffering in some way in the physical world. Obviously, the Christian sources took it in a different direction with the deification of a human being, but there's a fine line between the deification of a human being and the divinization of human beings more broadly. And Judaism tends to see people as possessing God's essence in the way that is described in Genesis. In particular, there's a very famous text in the Talmud, which I'm sure Elie Wiesel is commenting on secretly in this passage, describing the rule in Deuteronomy where it says that you can't leave a criminal to hang overnight. So if a criminal is hanged by the court, their body has to be cut down and buried that day. They're not allowed to be left overnight. It's described as a horrible violation of the commandments if someone leaves them up overnight. The Talmud, in asking about this story, asking about this law, tells a story about an individual who was hung for his crimes and hung on a tree. And when people walked past, there was a wicked king who refused to cut him down. And as people walked past the next day and they saw the corpse on the tree, they said, "Who's that up there?" And someone said, "Oh, that's the king. That's the king up there on the tree." And as a result, the king's kind of power fell apart, this wicked king behind the story. And the sentiment, of course, is an analogy to humans and God, and the idea that actually the idea that we can't leave someone hanging on the tree, even if they're kind of convicted criminal in the sense that Deuteronomy describes, is because everyone has the image of God in them, and it would be disrespectful to do that. So there's a sense of that which comes out here in Elie Wiesel's retelling of his own experience. But there's also a way in which he's kind of challenging the idea that God is powerful at all, right? God is suffering. God is dying at the hands of the Nazis. God is not able to stop it. Instead, God is suffering alongside it. And although he doesn't say it in theological terms, it has a real theological resonance. He says it in a literary way, but his contemporary, Hans Jonas, says it in a much more theological way. And this is quite a hard paragraph to understand. So you have to help me to understand this academic language here. It's quite irritating, but the idea is very good. Hans Jonas, in writing a book called The Concept of God After Auschwitz, very, very useful for our discussion, says the elimination of divine omnipotence, which follows from our discussion of power, leaves us with the alternatives of either some pre-existent theological or ontological dualism, or of God's own self-limitation through the creation from nothing. The first, that is the dualism, is plainly unacceptable to Judaism. The second answers at best the problem of imperfection and natural causality. The use of the latter in the hands of responsible agents, Auschwitz rather than the earthquake of Lisbon, with which Jewish theologians had to contend at this hour. Creation was that act of absolute sovereignty with which it consented for the sake of self-determined finitude to be absolute no more. Philosophers, right? But I think that the last sentence is really the focal point. Creation was that act of absolute sovereignty with which it consented for the sake of self-determined finitude to be absolute no more. Now you could read that 12 times, that might not make more sense. But what I hear in that is this concept that actually we have to understand creation itself as an exercise in limitation. Right? God, by virtue of creating the world, is limiting God's power, because if God didn't limit God's power, creation would be overwhelmed because God is infinite. And the result is that the world itself, the existence of the world that we live in, the material world, is conditional on God restricting God's own power, on setting, as it says here, self-determined finitude, on setting at the outset a limit to what God can and can't do in order to allow the world to exist. Meaning that in the world we live in, God is not omnipotent. Now, it kind of toes the line here, because he's saying God is actually omnipotent, but not as we experience it in our world. So pre-world, pre-creation, God is omnipotent. But once creation happens, God is not, because omnipotence and creation are paradoxical. Although he doesn't say it in a very clear way, I think that idea is really, really powerful. And actually, it's drawing a lot on a lot of mystical sources. So those of you who have spent some time learning the Zohar with me may have looked at passages which talk about the creation itself as being a self-constriction. The word is tzimtzum in Hebrew, a great word that means to kind of squeeze something up. When you squeeze a sponge, you tzimtzum it. And that's how it describes God in the process of creation, is having to restrict God's self to allow for the world to exist. And the result is that the world as we know it is filled with chaos, with what we might perceive as evil, and God is not completely able to step in and stop it. God asks us to be partners in helping to stop it as a result. So because of God's limitation, God needs human help to be able to address the chaos and evil in the world. And the result is, of course, God isn't able to step in when we need, but also God is suffering alongside us. As Wiesel said, right, God is right here on these gallows, meaning God is suffering as we are suffering. He's suffering through the body of that young boy. And it's very much the sense that it's a purposeful limitation of omnipotence, which we have to deal with if we want the world to exist. The third source takes the suffering element quite much deeper. And this is, especially in its context, extremely profound, because this author, Rabbi Kalonymus Kalman Shapira, better known for obvious reasons based on his name as the Eish Kodesh, after the book he wrote, The Holy Fire. He was the rabbi who was the rabbi of Warsaw before the Nazi occupation of Poland, and he ended up being kind of the rabbi of the Warsaw Ghetto. And he wrote his sermons and his kind of views down in the course of his experience living in the Warsaw Ghetto. He died in the uprising of the Warsaw Ghetto, which is commemorated today, actually. And he buried his writings along with a variety of other documents in the ghetto, which were then found after the war. So his writing is often very beautiful and interesting. And when you think about the fact that he's writing in 1943 inside the Warsaw Ghetto, it gives it an extra weight in many ways. He says the following, which is kind of complementary to what we saw before. Our sacred literature tells us that when a Jew is afflicted, God suffers, as it were, much more than the person does. It may be that since God is not subject to any limitation, for which reason no conception of God is possible in the world, therefore God's suffering from Israel's troubles is also boundless. It's not merely that it would be impossible for a person to endure the experience of such great suffering, but even to conceive of God's suffering, to know that God does suffer, to hear God's voice, "Woe, for I have destroyed my house and exiled my children," is impossible, because God is beyond the confines of the human. So to me, he's kind of going back and forth in this source. He's saying God is unlimited, and as a result, God's ability to suffer with us is unlimited. Those two things are often at odds. And in particular, he evokes this quote here, "Woe, for I've destroyed my house and exiled my children," is from the Talmud as well, where the Midrash actually originally, where the Midrash imagines God following the destruction of the temple, right, which happened, by the way, as a result of human will, right, civil war, very political causes. But imagine God looking at the destroyed temple and saying, "Woe, I have destroyed my house and exiled my children," feeling the sense of guilt and suffering and the inability to change the circumstance. God suffers as we do. And there's many descriptions in the Midrash in particular that the rabbis construct of God as actually being quite limited, as suffering when we suffer, as feeling what we're feeling, a God kind of full of pathos, of the sympathetic sense that when we have disease and pain, God is there alongside with us. Now, in some ways, this is the most easy view to accept in modernity, because we live in a world in which we have a very acute sense of evil and suffering around us, especially post-Holocaust. But it also has its downsides. Each of them have their downsides, right? The first one, the downside is, of course, God seems like a jerk, because you have this vision of God that's kind of just being really mean to everyone. The second one, God is kind of, you know, unnecessary, almost kind of unaccessible. God is somewhere else, ignoring what's going on, unable to see what's happening. It makes it very hard to justify why we should even bother, as Scott suggested. This one, although I think it speaks to me personally, and maybe to many of us very well, the downside is, of course, that we lose the sense of God as this omnipotent force that can do anything, right? We get, as a result, the benefit is that we get an idea of God which is understanding and suffering and relatable, and a God which we can't hold accountable for all the ill of the world. People do bad things, God can't always stop them, and God and us suffer together. But it's always a trade-off, right? What we started out looking at, these three options, it's a trade-off. It's 2 out of 3. Pick 2, one of them has to go. And in each of these, we've seen a way in which we're abandoning one of the views of God, whether it's God as omnibenevolent, omniscient, or omnipotent here, and we're getting, as a result, a different view on what God means and how God relates to our suffering. All of them are responding to the Holocaust, but they're all doing it in really different ways. I'm curious if anyone wants to respond to these sources here about God as not omnipotent. Stephen?
Yeah, is there not a bridge between option 2 and option 3? If you accept that option 2, God created morality by giving people free choice to do good and bad, and therefore God has to stand back. In option 3, God stands back and cannot have the power, and therefore feels the suffering, or when people make bad choices, whether it be human suffering or, no doubt, suffering through natural disaster suffering.
Yeah.
Isn't there a, there isn't, if one buys, because there is another option, which is actually, you say, well, in the third one, well, maybe God existed during creation, but God has departed from our lives. If you take it a bit further.
I mean, I think there is a bridge, and I think that actually they lead on to each other in a lot of ways. I think the distinction that the authors here make is that in the second one, God is really absent, right? It's not that God is here suffering with us. God is gone, which, as you kind of suggested, which in some ways absolves God from responsibility. We can't say, oh, God, you did such awful things, because God wasn't here. The third one, God is here, but unable to do anything. So there's a slight difference there that I think does make a kind of a difference in terms of what life looks like and what theology looks like. These views are also corollaried in other traditions, right? Especially in the modern period. So the first view is very much like Christian Calvinist Protestantism, right? The kind of extreme retribution, fire and brimstone type preaching of the 17th century really reflects our first view. Our second view is very much the deism of the same period, right? The deism of the founders of America, of Freemasonry, the sense that God created the world and then kind of walked away from it. And the third view is actually much more like Spinoza, like pantheism, because the sense that God suffers with the world is, as you said, Stephen, not just human suffering, but the entire world, that God is in some way omnipresent in the world, and as a result, suffering with it, which is part of the reason I think it's most relatable for the modern Jew, is because actually there's a very ecological sense to the third one, or there can be at least, that you can see God as coterminous with the world, in which God has limited God's self to exist, and as a result, anything that happens, good or bad, affects God just the same as everything else, because God is present in everything else. And so I think that, the differences between those, and it's true, by the way, the Christian tradition as well, the deism led on to the pantheism. Spinoza couldn't have said what he said without the people who said the deistic view before, and the Protestants are kind of off to their side in the way that they did, the kind of extreme Calvinists. But all three of them often have overlap and nuance, and there's other sources which don't fit so neatly into these three categories. But inevitably, when you come really down to it, any theological response, which is trying to answer the question of why the Holocaust happened, is going to have to abandon either the idea that God is all powerful, or the idea that God is all knowing, or the idea that God is all good. And I'm curious if anyone else has any thoughts on this third one. I have one more thing I want to share with you, which is quite long, which I think leads on from the third one. It's almost not quite a fourth one, but it leads on from the third one. But I'm aware that you've heard me talking for far too long, and I'm curious if anyone else wants to share which of these they find compelling, or none, by the way. Silence. Yes, I see a hand raised, but I don't think we can hear you. I'm sorry.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Oh, yes, I can hear you, Murray.
Hi. So I'm Murray. I think that what I found compelling about the second one is the way you were describing it about God not being able to, he can fix anything, but he will lack the knowledge. And I'm curious if this overlaps with any Einsteinian thought about the scientific concept of a deity.
I mean, absolutely. I think because, like we said, at least the corollary between the second view and the deistic view of the early modern period, Einstein felt very inspired by that kind of deism, in which he had a room for God in terms of having created, but not much room for God in terms of sustaining. Right? God kind of created and then let it go. Right? God kind of just released natural forces to do their thing. Very much the view of Isaac Newton, and very much the view of scientists in the early days of science, before they started to kind of abandon the religious basis of science, when it very much matched up with a view of God, that God kind of started things off, but then mostly left the scene. And it does have its benefits, right? It allows you to preserve a view of God, which is very positive and very clean, but without all the negativity that we might see with the first option or the third option. The third option, the one we just looked at, is really messy, right? God is down here in the dirt with us, suffering and getting ill, and all of that feels very challenging to traditional theology, because traditional theology wants to see God as very elevated. So there's definitely a way in which scientific approaches, especially of Einstein and others, matches up with the second view, that God is kind of hidden and embedded within things which we can't see. I'd love to hear if anyone else wants to chime in, but I want to also share with you a little bit about my own basis for this. Ian has just rejoined us. And also a little bit about this last source that I want to share with you, which I think is, for me, I kind of started with the end and went backwards, because for me, I think one of the things we do very poorly as Jewish communities and as rabbis is address these questions, right? I mean, for me, growing up, and certainly in kind of my early days in Jewish life, no one ever gave me a compelling answer to these questions, and no one ever framed it in a way that I was able to make sense of. I think the honesty of saying, actually, you've got to choose, you can only have 2 out of 3 attributes of God from our list before, is really helpful, because it allows us to be able to weigh the differences, to weigh whether we relate to a God who's not all-powerful, or a God who's not all-knowing, or whether we relate to a God who actually isn't very good. And some people relate to God that way, some people relate to God in our second way, and some people in the third way. But I think the third way, I mean, this is all in many ways an argument for the third way, because I think the third way makes the most compelling sense with Judaism, in which if we look at the Torah itself, the whole idea of a covenant is kind of assuming that God isn't all powerful, right? Why does God need us to sign a deal to say that we're going to help with all of this stuff, with making the world better, with finishing creation? But the notion that the rabbis construct that creation is incomplete, that we're still on day 6, is the absolute assumption that God is not completely in control, that things aren't totally done, that God needs us to step in and to help. And it's that pathos, that need, that relationship, which I think is the most compelling argument for religion, is that, to me, I'd much rather try and connect with a God who is a partner than a God who is a distant parent, or a God who's a mean, a wrathful parent. The third vision of God in partnership with us, in both our blessings and our sufferings is one that I think is the only kind of, at the end of the day, sellable theological story. And part of the reason for that is because in my own views, I was really influenced by Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was a rabbi of the modern 1950s, 1960s, like many of these gentlemen, who kind of left the Hasidic world and came to teach at JTS, the Masorti Seminary in New York. And he combined together a lot of the Hasidic views that we would have seen in this last source, in the Eish Kodesh, with also a real sense of justice and the need for religion to help promote justice in the world around us. And he gave a speech, which I want to read part of to you. I realize it's quite long, but I think it's worth it, in 1943. So he gave a speech in 1943. He was a relatively young man. He grew up in Germany. He was a rabbi trained in Germany, and he left just before 1942. He left to teach at the Reform Seminary in Cincinnati, and as a result kind of got out just when he could, lost most of his family in the Holocaust. And in 1943, at an assembly of clergy in America, he gave the following speech, or this is an excerpt from the following speech, which was called The Meaning of This Hour. And he tried to convey what the Holocaust means for theology, and he very much is basing himself, I think, on the third view. And I just want to read this to you, and obviously you can follow along, but I think it's worth spending the time on. Our world seems not unlike a pit of snakes. We did not sink into the pit in 1939 or even in 1933. We had descended into it generations ago, and the snakes have sent their venom into the bloodstream of humanity, gradually paralyzing us, numbing nerve after nerve, dulling our minds, darkening our vision. Good and evil that were once as real as day and night have become a blurred mist. In our everyday life, we worshipped force, despised compassion, and obeyed no law but our unappeasable appetite. The vision of the sacred has all but died in the soul of man. And when greed, envy, and the reckless will to power came to maturity, the serpents cherished in the bosom of our civilization broke out of their dens to fall upon the helpless nations. It was through our failure that people started to suspect that science is a device for exploitation, parliaments pulpits for hypocrisy, and religion a pretext for a bad conscience. In the tantalized souls of those who had faith in ideals, suspicion became a dogma and contempt the only solace. Mistaking the abortions of their conscience for intellectual heroism, many thinkers employ clever pens to scold and scorn the reverence for life, the awe for truth, the loyalty to justice. Man, about to hang himself, discovers it's easier to hang others. The conscience of the world was destroyed by those who were wont to blame others rather than themselves. Let us remember, we revered the instincts but distrusted the prophets. We labored to perfect engines and let our inner life go to wreck. We ridiculed superstition until we lost our ability to believe. We have helped extinguish the light our fathers had kindled. We have bartered holiness for convenience, loyalty for success, love for power, wisdom for information, tradition for fashion. We cannot dwell at ease under the sun of our civilization as our ancestors thought we could. What was in the minds of our martyred brothers in their last hours? They died with disdain and scorn for a civilization in which the killing of civilians could become a carnival of fun, for a civilization which gave us mastery over the forces of nature, but lost control over the forces of ourself. God will return to us when we shall be willing to let him in, into our banks and factories, into our Congress and clubs, into our courts and investigating committees, into our homes and theaters. For God is everywhere or nowhere, the Father of all men or no man, concerned about everything or nothing. Only in his presence will we learn that the glory of man is not in his will to power, but in his power of compassion. There is a divine dream which the prophets and rabbis have cherished and which fills our prayers and permeates the acts of true piety. It is a dream of a world rid of evil by the grace of God, as well as by the efforts of man, by his dedication to the task of establishing the kinship of God in the world. God is waiting for us to redeem the world. We should not spend our life hunting for trivial satisfactions, while God is waiting constantly and keenly for our effort and devotion. The Almighty has not created the universe that we may have opportunities to satisfy our greed, envy, and ambition. We have not survived that we may waste our years in vulgar vanities. The martyrdom of millions demands that we consecrate ourselves to the fulfillment of God's dream of salvation. Israel did not accept the Torah of their own free will. When Israel approached Sinai, God lifted the mountain and held it over their heads, saying, either you accept the Torah or be crushed beneath the mountain. The mountain of history is over our heads again. Shall we renew the covenant with God? For me, this sentiment is very much the practical result of the view that we saw in number 3. It's the view that actually the reality of the world around us is one in which we cannot deny evil. We cannot deny that evil, whether natural or human, exists. And we have to both kind of take responsibility for it in the way in which humans have to take responsibility for all other humans, but also turn towards God as a partner, not as someone who's responsible for the evil, not as someone who doesn't care, but as someone who cares deeply and as who wants things to be good, but needs us to help make that the case. And for me, I think that's the only modern theodicy that makes sense, is what Rabbi Heschel spoke so powerfully of in 1943, when the world was standing already in the precipice of disaster, long past the precipice of disaster, and he was trying to get people to turn back and look at what it is that their view of God and theodicy would allow them to do. I think that really important to this conversation is that our view of what the answer is to this question matters. This isn't a purely academic question. If you believe the first one, as our Haredi rabbis that we cited do, then your view of humanity and your view of the world around us is quite dark. People are bad, God punishes us. If you believe the second one, that God is absent, then in some way it's also a very kind of sad and bleak vision of the world, where the power of spirituality, the power of our tradition, is just kind of lost because it's all in the past and not in the present. But it's the third view, that God is actually not all powerful, that God suffers, that God needs us, that God made a covenant with us so that we can help fix the world together and bring about a better one. That is actually a good impetus for our action and also a good impetus for our religious life. So I think in looking at the question of the Holocaust and how it changed Jewish theology, it actually does really matter. It's not just academic. Whether we find 1, 2, or 3 persuasive, whether we're inspired by omnipotence or omnibenevolence or omniscience, it really matters which one speaks to us, because it will affect how we see ourselves and how we see the world, and ultimately how we see God and religion as well. So I'm really happy if anyone has any questions. I'm aware that we have 5 minutes in our allotted time, and I don't want to go for it. Ian Abrams, does your sound work now? You're on mute. We still can't hear you. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. You can type in the chat if you want, and that way we can see what you want to say. I'm really quite curious. And anyone want to share anything about these sources, or any reflections, or have any questions, or anyone feel like actually none of these make any sense and they're all crap? That's also very valid.
Can I just jump in if no one else is jumping in, Adam?
Yeah, please, by all means.
I think the last thing from Herschel is very empowering, because it's actually saying that it's about not just our view of God, it's our view of our relationship with God and what we can do in terms of seeing the prophetic nature of religion and God, and actually what we can do to try and actually bring about some justice in the world, even in the face of injustice.
Yeah, it's
empowering us to do something for that relationship, not just to expect the omni bit of God, in how we see God, because some of those other descriptions of God are things I've been brought up with in my early years, whereas that sort of relationship with God, about doing justice with God as a partner, is a very different sort of concept.
It is, and like many of the things we've seen, it's totally a double-edged sword, right? Which is that it's entirely empowering, because it means that we can have the power. God is maybe missing some power, but we have more than we thought. But it also, the flip side, means that we have a huge amount of responsibility, right? If God can't fix the things that go wrong, then we have to step up. And that's what Heschel is really appealing to, is that sense of responsibility for civilization. That without that, we can't rely on God to do it for us. I think that it's the dual nature of that which is so important. I just see Ian's managed to type, which I'm very glad for. He says, does Heschel's view just apply to Jews or everyone in the world? How can the actions of Jews, such a small group of people, could have presented the Shoah? A really good question. I think, I mean, I don't want to speak for him, and he may say elsewhere more about it. He definitely sees the Jews as having a special role vis-a-vis this partnership with God. Everyone is in a partnership with God. Humanity and actually nature is in a partnership with God. But he sees the Jews, by virtue of the Torah and the covenant, as being kind of the vanguard of that covenant, right? The Jews are the ones that have to set the example. He evokes a common rabbinic statement that the Jews are like the oldest sibling in a family, right? That the family of nations are all siblings, and it's the oldest sibling who has to kind of do things first and set a good example, and then everyone else will hopefully follow the lead. And that tends to be the way in which Heschel and others look at the idea of chosen people. We're not special in that we're ontologically different from other people. We're special in that we have to take the first steps. We have to be the ones who are brave enough to stand up and take that action and responsibility, and then hopefully it'll lead on to other people doing the same. So there's a distinction to be made between Jews and other people, but it's not one of essence as much as it is of kind of assignment, if that makes sense. Yeah. Anything else before we log off this evening? I realize it's quite heavy ideas. Oh, how did the audience at the Abbey respond? It's interesting. Christian audiences are great. I love teaching at the Abbey because they're all super respectful, and they never really ask any interesting questions because they don't want to offend me, which is it's taken some time to build up the trust that I can convince them it's okay to ask questions. It's very different than Jews generally. We're comfortable asking questions. Several people there were quite challenged by these views because many of them, as religious Christians, said, we don't need any of these three options because we have option 4, which is Jesus, right? And so Christianity is kind of playing with a different ball, so to speak. It's a different sport because when you have this notion that there's an individual whose death kind of cleansed evil, who defeats death itself, it means that you kind of change the goalposts a little bit. And for Christians, they often are having a different discussion. Christians are much more likely to stop where we started in the first 5 minutes and say evil is an illusion and doesn't exist. There's lots of Christian sources which say there is no evil. It's all an illusion. Evil is only evil because you feel it as such, but it's not really evil. There's also a lot of Christian sources which have taken a path which wasn't one of our options, which is dualism, which has said actually evil comes from the devil, not from God. The Christianity has kind of unwittingly become very dualistic in some circles, where they acknowledge that there's God and the devil, and they're at odds, and they're in a war. That's another easy way to answer the question, because you can say, yeah, it's that guy's fault, right? Blame him, not God, it's that guy. But we don't have that luxury. So without having the luxury of having the devil, and without having the luxury of having Jesus, it means that we actually have to have a little bit more careful consideration of what Harold Kushner laid out in that book, which is, there's 3 things we say about God. Not all of them can be true. And that's why it's really, that book he wrote for a broad audience, but it's really speaking from a Jewish perspective, because Christians would look at that and go, yeah, but we have another way out, I think, generally. And many people said similar things at the Abbey. They said, well, this doesn't seem to relate. But it was interesting, I think, for them to see how other traditions, which didn't have the benefit, they see the benefit of Jesus in the theology, have to come up with other solutions. So I think they saw us as very clever for having come up with interesting solutions in the absence of course, the truth from their point of view. It's 8:30, and as promised, I'm attempting to be timely in a very unrabbinic fashion. But I just really want to thank you for being here and for listening to me. This is usually a much more discussion-based kind of thing, not me standing in my living room talking with my arms. But I think that actually, the sources speak for themselves to a certain extent, and they give a really interesting view of how Jews have responded to the Holocaust. And whether you agree with me that the third one is the best, or whether you agree with Heschel that actually we can use that third view for our own theology today, it gives you some sense of where Jews are coming from and how they've approached this very big question. And this question, which even now, 75, 76 years after the Holocaust is finished, is still an active one, because it does matter to how we see ourselves and God. And hopefully I've convinced you even a little bit of that. So thank you for joining us. I'm going to take everyone off mute in case they want to say hi or whatever else. Some of you are still on mute. Appreciate you joining me this night for this. And there's lots of Yom HaShoah stuff going on tomorrow night and Tuesday as well via Zoom. So keep an eye out for that. It's been in the shul email as well.
Adam, can you make available the text that you showed us so that we can have a look back and have the opportunity to digest them a little bit more?
Yes, I'll put the text and the recording, if that's okay with everyone, online and send it around.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.